Presently, a bit over a decade after where we were last week. That is, as you will undoubtedly recall, last week we were discussing Jacob and his family as they return to the land of Israel. Returning to the land of Israel after having spent 20 years in Haran, in Lavan's house. So, upon what basis can I tell you we're around a decade later? By simple arithmetic. Joseph, we read explicitly, was born after the 14 years of working as Lavan's shepherd for the hands of both Leah and Rachel in marriage had ended. That's why when Joseph is born, Jacob can say to Lavan, I'm ready to go home. Since Lavan convinced Jacob to stay on to work his flocks for salary for another 6 years, at the time that Jacob and family embarked for home, Joseph would have been 6. Well, the Torah tells us over here that Joseph is 17 years old. And as such, of course, inevitably we recognize roughly a decade, thereabouts, has elapsed since our discussion of last time. And we read at the beginning of chapter 37. At the beginning of chapter 37, we read, And Jacob dwelt in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. So, of course, Jacob is home. He returns to the land of Israel. And undoubtedly, the dual emphasis, both points should have been superfluous. We know Jacob had returned to the land of his father's sojournings, and we know that it is the land of Canaan, may help clarify to us what the emphasis is in dwelt, or perhaps we could render that better, the Hebrew vayeshev, as Jacob settled, settling down. Jacob had spent, again, 20 years working the flocks of Lavan in Haran. And now he has settled down in the land of his father's sojourning. And as such, the land that represents the legacy of Abraham and Isaac's missions. It is the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. Jacob, by simple arithmetic, is no youngster at this point. That is, since we recognize that when Joseph stood before Pharaoh, he was 30 years old. And when Jacob and all his family came down to Egypt, Joseph said, 2 years of the famine are over and another 5 years remain. So 2 years of famine plus 7 years of plenty means at the time Joseph was 39. And at that juncture, he brings Jacob to meet the Pharaoh, and Jacob says that he is 130 years old in response to Pharaoh's inquiry. So, if Jacob is 130 when Joseph is 39, by simple arithmetic, when Joseph is 17, Jacob is 108 years old. Not a youngster. And so he's not the one who's working as shepherd anymore. Rather, as we read in the second verse, after the introduction, these are the generations of Jacob, Joseph, 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. They are the shepherds. Being still a lad, even with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. He's with them. But simultaneously we recognize he isn't entirely with them. An orphan boy from his mother. He has one full brother, but Benjamin is significantly younger, born only after the return to the land of Israel. In other words, he's 10 or 11 years old. Not enough of a contemporary at this stage of life of Joseph. He is the youngest of all the other brothers, and all the other brothers have full brothers of their own, and Joseph, odd man out. But there's more to it than that. The Torah relates that Joseph brought evil report of them to their father. The Torah also tells us that Israel loved Joseph more than all his children. And of course, as we see in the next verse, as we will yet discuss at much greater length, his brothers hated him. This is a story that focuses upon three: Jacob, Joseph, and collectively the other brothers. Not that all of them are the same, but when we consider these three, Jacob, Joseph, and the other brothers, no one comes out of this story looking very good. I remember a number of years ago, a student of mine commented to me that it seems awfully glaring that Abraham and Isaac have reasonably functional families and Jacob is a complete failure. A comment that struck me, of course, as rather odd, since we don't think of either Ishmael or Esau as spiritual success stories. That is, they leave and they cease to be part of the mission initiated by Abraham altogether. And yet, although all of Jacob's children remain part and parcel of the emergent nation that embodies the legacy of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the nation of Israel. At this point, sure does seem like a pretty dysfunctional family. Trying to kill their brother, kidnapping, selling him. I want to stress that there is nothing in our tradition to erase the enormity of the guilt of all parties involved here. In particular, we have a tradition that the enormity of the guilt of the brothers was such that approximately 1,500 or more years later, the horrific suffering imposed by the Romans upon the sages of Israel whom they martyred was a kind of expiation of the lingering guilt over that crime. So we're not going to do anything to poo-poo, to diminish the enormity of the crime that was perpetrated here. I must note, it's not just the brothers. Jacob comes in for some very stern chastisement in our tradition for the favoritism he showed Joseph. And Joseph, too, after all, comes in for significant rebuke over having brought evil reports of his brothers to their father. So no one is going to emerge from this story unscathed. And yet, on the one hand, I consider this very narrative to be among the most powerful indicators of the divinity of the Torah. Show me one other document from the ancient world, and with very few exceptions, even from the modern world, of a nation that records its own failures, the sins of its founders and forefathers. Generally speaking, when a nation is the author of its own history, it diminishes or ignores, covers over anything unpleasant. But then we don't believe this is a history that was written by the nation. It was written by God. So again, on the one hand, we're not going to diminish the significance of the crime. And it's important for us to focus on just how glaring the shortcomings were of everyone who played a role in the final result. Otherwise, we're not learning from the story. And again, of course, remember, we've noted this on many occasions. The word Torah means teaching. It's teaching us how to live. We learn lessons on how to live by positive example, and we learn lessons on how to live also by negative example. That's all on the one hand. On the other hand, if we are merely going to relate to Jacob, Joseph, and all the other brothers as failures, as criminals, period, we're not really going to learn too much from them either. We need to consider where exactly the failure, the error, lay, if we are truly to learn from them. There's an additional dimension that certainly needs to be stressed here. And that is, if it were simply a matter of rendering an indictment, look what they did, look where they ended up, well, there wouldn't be much else to add. But consider the following two indicators that there is inevitably more here than meets the eye. I must concede at the outset, these bits of evidence are not my own discoveries. I'm gleaning them from classic commentaries, but be that as it may, I think it's important for us to consider what they have to say. And in general, you know, I make no pretense of coming up with these ideas on my own. I sit at the feet of all of our mentors over history, in imbibing our tradition and what we can learn from it. So, two indicators. Number one, in Genesis chapter 42. Now this is when the brothers have already come down to Egypt and are being treated to a very hard time by the anonymous ruler, who of course we know is Joseph. After imprisoning them for 3 days, Joseph says to them on the third day, "This do and live, for I fear God." And he tells them that he's going to keep one of them prisoner pending the arrival of the youngest brother. Whereupon, in hearing about his verdict, the brothers, for the first time, express remorse for what they had done. What they had done over 20 years earlier. And they said one to another, "We are verily guilty concerning our brother." What are we guilty over? "In that we saw the distress of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us." This is, mind you, when they're expressing remorse. Note, they're not expressing remorse over having tried to kill him. There's no regret expressed here over having sold him as a slave. The remorse is very specific. It's over having been hard-hearted. That when he besought us, we didn't hear. And indeed, 20 years earlier, it's awfully glaring, in Genesis chapter 37, that in the whole narrative of the sale of Joseph, there's not a word stated that actually informs us that he was pleading with them. Because at the time, they had concluded that what they were doing was right. And therefore, they didn't hear any pleas. It took 20 years plus for Joseph's pleas to even be heard by them. But again, note, all they express regret for is having not heard the pleas. Not that they tried to kill him and they sold him into slavery. And Joseph himself seems to be satisfied with this level of remorse because 3 verses later, since he overheard them, they thought he didn't understand Hebrew, he turned himself about from them and wept. Here's them expressing remorse. But again, not for trying to kill him, not for selling him into slavery, just for having ignored his pleas. They should have done what they did, but they shouldn't have been cruel about it. That's what seems to emerge from this narrative. Of course, inevitably, then we're going to have to understand what, in their minds, still, after all this time, justified their behavior. I said I have 2 indicators. That's the first one. Indicator number 2 is from Exodus chapter 28, where we read about the vestments of the high priest. And in that context, among the vestments, on the shoulders of the high priest, the end of the straps of the ephod, the Torah says, verse 9, "You shall take 2 onyx stones and engrave on them the names of the children of Israel." Now, mind you, that doesn't mean the nation of Israel. That means the children of Israel, Jacob, 12 tribes. 6 of their names on one stone, the names of the other 6 on the other stone, according to the names of the children of Israel. Why? To be stones of memorial for the children of Israel, that Aaron shall bear their names before God upon his 2 shoulders for a memorial. Names of whom? Of base, vulgar criminals? Evidently not. evidently, people who were of so exalted a spiritual stature that their names are incorporated into the holy vestments of the high priest. And of course, not only there, also, we read shortly thereafter, the breastplate of judgment. And the Torah tells us, you shall set in it settings of stones, 4 rows of stones, and the stones will be according to the names of the children of Israel. Again, that means the actual children of Israel, Jacob. 12 according to their names. The 12 tribes. And Aaron shall bear the names of the children of Israel in the breastplate of judgment upon his heart when he goes in unto the holy place for a memorial before God continually. And in so doing, says the Torah, there shall be upon Aaron's heart when he goes in before God, and Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel upon his heart before God continually. In other words, the judgment of the children of Israel. In our tradition, the breastplate worn over the heart of the high priest provides a kind of atonement for errors that inadvertently take place in the adjudication of the courts. Significant, isn't it? That this article that is to provide atonement for errors in judgment of the courts incorporates in it the names of the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob, Israel. Because they exemplify an error in the judgment of the court. The court that comprised them in their judgment of their brother Joseph. In order to understand what that means and where their error lay, we have our work cut out for us. I have to concede that, as you may have already noticed, I have dubbed this session Part 1. This is something I didn't initially plan to do, but realized it's unavoidable. We're going to be spending, God willing, an additional session on this subject because I think understanding what's going on here is sufficiently important to warrant the time. We still need to understand all 3 of the guilty parties here. Again, Jacob, Joseph, and the other brothers. For now, I would merely like to call your attention to a couple of observations regarding the first 2, Jacob and Joseph, because I'd like to focus this evening principally on the brothers. As for Jacob, again, I'm going to reiterate. In our tradition, Jacob is excoriated for having shown favoritism to one of his children. But, just notice, verse 1 says, and Jacob dwelt in the land of his father's sojournings. That's his name after all, isn't it? Next verse, verse 2. These are the generations of, what's his name again? Jacob. These are the generations of Jacob. Verse 3, Israel. loved Joseph more than all his children. The switch over from Jacob to Israel is pretty glaring here. And although we haven't had a chance yet to discuss at length the distinction between these two names, it's pretty obvious on some plane. And it will leave a more detailed plane for another opportunity, that the name Jacob, which ostensibly, after all, comes from a human source, and refers to nothing more sublime, more significant than the fact that he was holding on to his brother's heel when he was born, is the name that describes Jacob as an individual on his own. The name Israel, you have struggled with angels of God and man and have prevailed. Greatness. The role of the forefather, the significant source of everything that then follows in the history of the nation we call Israel. The one who loved Joseph more than all of his children is not called Jacob here. He's called Israel. And I submit to you that what the Torah is manifestly intimating is, even if the favoritism was misguided, it wasn't something crass or incidental. It wasn't a reflection of a father just playing favorites among his children. Rather, Israel, the name of greatness, discerns in Joseph some unique attributes. Not merely that he was born in old age. Benjamin is even younger. But then the Hebrew Ben Zekunim can mean son of his old age. It can mean the son who is endowed with special gifts of wisdom. It can mean, perhaps, that Jacob discerned in Joseph a character similarity to himself, and by consequence, in choosing a son to be his own personal attendant, Joseph was the one whom he designated. And it could be that for precisely that reason, he made him the coat of many colors, or a long colorful coat, fine woolen coat. There are different renditions of what the Hebrew ketonet pasim means. Indeed, it's important for us to appreciate that it wasn't a crass, vulgar, incidental decision. It was Israel. But it was still wrong. I can't help but note here that there is a tantalizing cognate passage to this one a few chapters later in Genesis chapter 48, when we read about Jacob upon his deathbed. And in the entire narrative, we read about him as Jacob, until Joseph comes with his two sons, Menashe and Ephraim. And his father insists upon giving precedence to the younger son, Ephraim, over Menashe. And in the entire passage, the name Jacob doesn't appear even once. It's always Israel. Again, don't think that it was some superficial favoritism of the grandfather for one grandson over the other either. There is depth. It is Israel. But that's, of course, a different story. We'll leave it on the side for now. What's relevant for the purposes of our discussion at present, of course, is that Jacob, Israel, undoubtedly had his reasons. But the brothers don't know that this decision is undertaken on the level of Israel. I guess they didn't read Genesis chapter 37. so far as they were concerned, all they saw was that their father Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his brothers, and they hated him. But of course, that hatred also derives, we already noted this, from Joseph's own conduct. If we ask, what prompts Joseph to bring evil report of his brothers to their father? I must propose to you that I think we can all infer where Joseph is coming from. I'll at least speak for myself. As an impetuous youngster, feeling driven to correct people for their own good. Because after all, if I have something to say that can help guide them to improve, then of course I should, shouldn't I? As we grow older, we recognize that often the best thing that we can do is to keep our peace and keep quiet. But Joseph is 17 years old. He is, mind you, with his brothers. And undoubtedly, he feels toward them as a loving brother would. A sense of responsibility, a desire to correct them. And if he can't correct them on his own, to enlist their father in doing so. But so far as his brothers are concerned, he is just bearing evil reports, the talebearer to their father. And, of course, as you know, the continuation of the story in verse 5, after we already are told that his brothers hated him and couldn't speak peaceably to him, Joseph dreamed a dream. And he told it to his brothers, and they hated him all the more. Now, if we consider what the text is telling us here, he didn't tell them the content of the dream yet. He just told them that he had a dream. That certainly is what's indicated in the Hebrew. He related it to his brothers. Why did they hate him all the more? Because, from his brother's perspective, he may be feigning love by being with them, but he really is plotting against them by trying to instigate his father to hate them. To whom does one communicate one's innermost thoughts, innermost feelings as exemplified in one's dreams? Only to a close, dear friend. The fact that Joseph is communicating dreams to his brothers, from Joseph's perspective, is evidence of his enduring love of them. From his brother's perspective, it's further evidence that he is a two-faced criminal who is trying to do them in. Feigning love on the outside while looking for more dirt to dig up about them on the inside. So coming to them and telling him about his dream, which might otherwise be seen as evidence of a close fraternal bond, to them is just further evidence that he is the enemy. Because we know very well, it happens all the time, when we perceive someone as our lover, even actions that might be to our detriment, we are inclined to explain away and justify. If we perceive someone as our enemy, even actions that seem indeed to be in our favor, we will understand as just further evidence of treachery. And so they do. But there's, of course, more to it than that. There is, after all, the content of the dream. The content of the dream, we were binding sheaves in the field. Now note, we were binding together. We were doing something as a joint endeavor, cooperation. But, lo, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and behold, your sheaves came round about and bowed down to my sheaf. And the response of the brothers, shall you indeed reign over us? Shall you indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. In what we have read in the foregoing, we have, I think, all of the raw material we need to try to understand the horrific crime that the brothers plotted to perpetrate against Joseph, and why, from their perspective, they indeed may well have been justified. First, consider verse 3 again. Israel loves Joseph more than all his children. And again, remember, they don't know it's on the level of Israel. So far as they're concerned, it's their father loved Joseph more than he loved them. There is, after all, precedent for this sort of thing. Undoubtedly, they knew family history. Their grandfather, Isaac, loved their uncle. And on what basis did he love their uncle? Remember, in the previous verse, Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. Now, we discussed this some weeks ago. I just want to reiterate in brief the summary. Namely, being a successful hunter is predicated upon being two-faced. You don't go into the woods making it obvious to the animals that you're trying to kill them. The successful hunter is able to create an impression that he's just going for a nice, peaceful walk in the woods, until when he finds his moment, he does in the animal that he's hunting. In other words, being a successful hunter means recognizing that there is a deeper level and a shallower, more superficial level. And you do your utmost to manipulate that superficial level in order to conceal the deeper level. And as we noted when we discussed these verses some weeks ago, it could very well be that Esau became so successful as a hunter, so successful in the duplicity that underlies a successful hunt, that he became adept at being equally duplicitous toward his own father. So Isaac loved Esau. And what would have happened if Isaac would have actually believed that Esau was his spiritual heir? What would have happened to the spiritual legacy of Abraham and Isaac? That mission, the earth-shaking, life-altering mission of the patriarchs, would have grinded to a halt, amounted to nothing more than a dead end. And the brothers see just the same thing happening 1 generation later. One brother is the beloved. And as far as they can see, he is the beloved because of the same sort of manipulativeness because Joseph is conveying evil reports about them to Jacob in order to instigate him to hate them. Sounds just like Isaac and Esau over again. In particular, when we consider the following. And at this point, please bear with me. I'd like to do a brief overview of world history from the beginning that we read in the Torah, from the generation of Adam and on, because there's a critical message emergent here that we might otherwise have missed. In every previous generation, there was one who was chosen, one who was the spiritual heir. All the rest may or may not be worthy, but they are in the supporting role. They're not the spiritual heir. Going back to the very beginning. Chapter 5 of Genesis. This is the birth of the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. And 2 verses later, Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image. Better than image, I think, would be to say here essence, because we're not speaking of a physical image. We're speaking of an inner essence. And we know with what likeness and essence Adam was endowed. Because God created man with his likeness and his essence. The divine essence with which Adam is endowed, he transmits to his son Seth. So Seth is the spiritual heir. Now note, in the very next verse, and the days of Adam after he begot Seth were 800 years, and he begot sons and daughters. There were many others, and they're all anonymous. Only one is named, the spiritual heir. And the same thing happens in the following generation. That is, in the following generation, Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. And afterwards, he lived another 807 years and begot sons and daughters. Again, the many anonymous ones. But Enosh is the spiritual heir. And so we read in the balance of Genesis chapter 5, each generation, and there are 10 generations between Adam and Noah, each generation there is one who is named. And there are numberless anonymous ones. Only one is the spiritual heir in the following generation. Until in the 10th generation, Lamech lived 182 years and begot a son. And he called his name Noah, saying, "This same shall comfort us in our work and in the toil of our hands, which comes from the ground, which God has cursed." In any case, Noah is the comforter, the consolation. Noah is the one, as opposed to all the rest. He also begot sons and daughters, and they are all of them nameless. And this isn't merely the evaluation of Lamech. This is also the evaluation, of course, of God. Noah found grace in the eyes of God. And we move on from Noah. Besides the realization that Noah is personally righteous and worthy of being the spiritual heir of his ancestors, Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yefet. And at the end of the story of Noah's life, we read, once again, who is chosen and who is not. So, of course, on the one hand, one who is clearly not, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brethren. Shem is the blessed one. And he said, "Blessed be God, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be their servant." And as for Yefet, who is also a worthy son, who also participated in the covering of Noach after his experience with intoxication. God enlarge or be gracious to Yefet. The following word in the Hebrew V'ishkon can be rendered either as he, referring to Yefet, shall dwell in the tents of Shem, or he, referring to God, shall dwell in the tents of Shem. Either way, the real focus, the chosen one, is Shem, not Yefet. Yefet has a role. It's a supporting role. Shem is chosen. So in this generation as well, there is a spiritual heir, and there are the others. And we continue at the end of the ensuing passage, chapter 11 in Genesis. Once again, we read generation after generation, 10 generations from Noach until Abraham. And in each one, there's one named offspring and the anonymous sons and daughters. Until finally, we get to the generation before that of Abraham. Terach lived 70 years and begot Abraham, Nachor, and Haran. And even if we don't read explicitly about a choosing, Terach took Abraham, his son. Lot, grandson, Sarai, Abraham's wife, and they set off for the land of Canaan. Abraham is the designated heir of Terach. And of course, not only by Terach, by God. At the beginning of chapter 12, we discussed this already. God says to Abraham, get you out of your country, your kindred, your father's house, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Abraham, again, the heir of his father, of his forebears. And we consider the following generation as well. And this, of course, is especially significant because we read at length about the various children of Abraham. When God says to Abraham at the age of 99 that he and Sarah will be having a son, he's 99 at the time, Sarah is 89. And Abraham says, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Either out of humility, not expecting such a great miracle, or simply the father who wants to hear that Ishmael will be worthy. And God's response is, no, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. You'll call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his seed after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes will he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac. Isaac is your spiritual heir, not Ishmael. And similarly, after the birth of Isaac, in chapter 21, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had born unto Abraham, making sport, referring, of course, to Ishmael. She says to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman will not be heir with my son, with Isaac. And God says to Abraham, in all that Sarah said to you, hearken unto her voice. Listen to Sarah. For in Isaac shall seed be called to you. He is your spiritual heir. He is your spiritual heir alone. The son of the bondwoman I will also make a nation, because he is your seed. But he's not your heir. And likewise, Abraham, has other sons as well. At the end, after Sarah's death, Abraham took another wife, Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Yokshan, Medan, Midian, Yishbak, Shuach. And after all the descendants of Abraham from Keturah are listed, the Torah tells us, and Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Unto the sons of the concubines, he gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son while he yet lived. Because again, there's only one spiritual heir. It's not a communal role. It is a singular role. And it's Isaac. And further on, the Torah tells us regarding the life of Ishmael that over against all his brethren he did settle. Not here, not in God's land that he bestows specifically upon Isaac, as expressed in chapter 26. We've seen this verse previously as well, that God appeared unto him and said, go not down unto Egypt, dwell in the land which I shall tell you of, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and will bless you, for unto you and your seed I will give all these lands, or the hard lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore unto Abraham your father, because you are his heir. You are the one. And, of course, in much the same vein, one generation later, two sons. The first, Esau. The second, Jacob. And we already discussed this. Esau is the cunning hunter. Jacob, quiet, simple, single-minded, dwelling in tents. Now, again recall, this too we've noted previously. While Isaac loved Esau, there are three blessings that he dispenses. One, to Jacob, thinking that it's Esau. The second, to Esau, knowing that it's Esau. The third, to Jacob, knowing that it is Jacob. The first two, exclusively material blessings. Both the blessing that Isaac gives to Jacob, thinking that it's Esau, and the blessing he gives to Esau, knowing that it's Esau. Those are material. The spiritual blessing mentioned only once in the entire passage, and that is in chapter 28 over here. Isaac called Jacob and blessed him, and charged him, and said unto him, don't take a wife of the daughters of Canaan, go to Padan Aram, to Lavan, and God Almighty bless you, and make you fruitful, and multiply you, and you may be a congregation of peoples, and give you the blessing of Abraham, spiritual blessing, to you and to your seed with you, that you may inherit the land of your sojournings which God gave Abraham. You are the designated spiritual heir. And of course, the designated spiritual heir gets the land. And again, it's not just Isaac who says this, it is God who says it. God appeared unto Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And in the ensuing verses, not only does he confirm the name Israel as opposed to Jacob, but moreover, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply, a nation and a company of nations shall be of you, and kings will come out of your loins, and the land which I gave unto Abraham and Isaac, to you I will give it, and to your seed after you I give the land. The land, again, part and parcel, significant component of the spiritual heir. The legacy that goes, again, generation by generation, to the spiritual heir here First Isaac, then Jacob. Because there is one who is chosen, and the others have some other role. And inevitably, we need to consider what that role is. But first, to recognize, so far, the others have all just been going off. Ishmael went off, dwelt elsewhere. Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, all the souls of his house, his cattle, all his beasts, all his possessions, and he went into a land which we can render here either as away from his brother Jacob or because of his brother Jacob, in the Hebrew mipnei, which can mean both. The Torah gives us a straightforward explanation of the move. That is, their substance was too great for them to dwell together. There wasn't enough pasture land. But, we have an additional dimension in our tradition that Esau went away because he was cognizant of the prophecy that God gave Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. That your seed will be strangers in a land not theirs, and they will subjugate and afflict them 400 years. That's part of the gift of the land. Esau says, you take it, I'm leaving. So Esau leaves. And of course, with that realization, again, comes the question that undoubtedly the sons of Jacob are attempting to address. What happens next? In the foregoing generations, other than the spiritual heir, no one else was left. Ishmael, the sons of Keturah, they go off. And at least from the perspective of the creation of that core of servants of God, we never hear from them again. Esau likewise. And the question is, what happens now? So we may well surmise that inasmuch as all of Jacob's sons are serving God, we can see that they all ultimately are servants of God. They figure, in this generation, even if there's one designated spiritual heir, doesn't mean that everyone else is just a cast-off. It means that everyone else can function in a supporting role in helping that spiritual heir attain his fruition, in maintaining the divine mission of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, very likely, we can imagine Jacob's sons anticipating that they would form, let's say, a confederation where all the other brothers would be assisting and supporting the one who is chosen as a spiritual heir. Whoever that chosen spiritual heir is, except the one who seems to be Jacob's favorite to be the spiritual heir, clearly to them at least, isn't interested in having any confederation with anybody else. He's just interested in getting on his father's good side by putting down all of his brothers. So consider then that Joseph from their perspective, is not just a threat to them. He is endangering the entire spiritual mission of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is jeopardizing that mission having a future, no less than Esau would have had Esau been the recipient of the spiritual blessing of Isaac. Now, Isaac again vouchsafed the spiritual blessing for Jacob. Now, Jacob seems to have succumbed to Joseph's trickery from their perspective, and he's ready to focus on Joseph as a spiritual heir, and everyone else will just be cast aside. And ultimately, then, not only do Jacob's sons stand to lose, the world will stand to lose, because the mission that was initiated by Abraham and advanced by Isaac and furthered by Jacob will grind to a halt if it is delivered into the hands of some crass manipulator who has no real abiding interest in spirituality, in godliness. That, I submit to you, is the first aspect of the brothers' perspective when they consider who it is with whom they need to deal in Joseph. That's aspect number one. But there's one additional aspect that we should consider as well, at least briefly. And that is what takes place in the aftermath of the first dream. Specifically, we saw this already. Shall you indeed reign over us? Shall you have dominion over us? And for this, they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. In the Hebrew, what is rendered here as reign over us is Hamaloch Timloch Aleinu. Will you be king over us? And considering how Joseph's brothers would have reacted to that, we inevitably need to consider what kings signified from their perspective. And so, we consider first, the first place where kingship is intimated anywhere in Scripture. It is in chapter 10. Cush begot Nimrod. And he began to be a mighty one. Perhaps we could render that better as he was the first to become powerful in the earth. And just like Uncle Esau, he was a mighty hunter before God. And we're already keyed to think in terms of the hunter signifies the two-facedness in the symbolism of Scripture. Nimrod is a mighty hunter. We can't help but note that the name Nimrod is identical to a Hebrew word, Nimrod, that means we shall rebel. Now, mind you, we can't claim that that's what the name means in Nimrod's language. And the Torah certainly doesn't indicate that the name indeed signifies a summons to rebellion. But it is tantalizing, is it not, that practically adjacent to the story of Nimrod, we read about a civilization that decided to build the Tower of Babel in order to ultimately rebel against God. And Nimrod is the first one who is described as having a kingdom. The beginning of his kingdom was, indeed, Babel, site of the tower, Tower of Babel. without even considering the possible connection between Nimrod and the tower. This narrative in verses 10, 11, 12 is all about worldly greatness, period, because that's all the king is concerned with. There's no spiritual overture here. There is no indication of anything sublime. It's all a matter of worldly greatness, becoming powerful in the earth, as Scripture expressed it in verse 8. So kings don't exactly signify the spiritual goal toward which we are oriented. In the description of Nimrod, we encounter the Hebrew mamlachto, his kingdom. We don't actually encounter the word king. The first place in Scripture that we encounter the actual word king is in Genesis chapter 14. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and Birsha, king of Amorah, Shinav, king of Admah, Shem-Ever, king of Tzoim, king of Bela, the same as Zoar. Note, you get kings together, what's the first thing they're doing? Going to war. Self-aggrandizement. There isn't any goal here to attain spirituality. There is no spiritual mission here to speak of. Only worldly greatness. You want to be king, they say to Joseph. And that further exacerbates their conviction that Joseph is a danger not only to them, but to the spiritual mission that has been handed down to them from their great-grandfather, their grandfather, and their father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I can't help but note here that, altogether, we have a general aversion to becoming subjects. And this is something that God, after all, articulates. In speaking of why entering into a bond of eternal servitude is something that is rejected by the Torah. God says, unto me the children of Israel are servants. They are my servants who I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. I am God your Lord. In other words, we are God's servants. We are not servants of flesh and blood. We are all of us endowed with that divine essence that endows us with the wherewithal to serve God, not merely flesh and blood. So someone who is bent upon becoming king is communicating all the wrong messages with respect to the relationship that we are supposed to cultivate with spirituality and with God. Indeed, in much this vein, inevitably, we understand what takes place in Numbers chapter 16, when Korach and Datan and Aviram and their 250 cohorts launch a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. They assembled themselves together with Moses and against Aaron and said unto them, you take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and God is among them all. Wherefore then lift ye up yourselves above the assembly of God. In other words, translating this into simple English, everyone is holy. Everyone has a connection with God. So, who needs leaders? We don't need you. This aversion to being led, being subjected to the rule of others, is something that is deeply ingrained in the Torah's message. Now, mind you, of course, Korach and his cohorts, were wrong. God had designated Moses and Aaron. And herein lies a crucial message, I think, to us all. Recognizing that everyone is holy and that everyone has a direct connection to God himself does not equate with, therefore, no leaders. Because on the contrary, leadership properly understood should be the means, the facilitator of everyone actualizing him or herself in connecting with God. Leadership shouldn't be a matter of casting people aside, of putting people down, rather on the contrary, enabling them to truly fulfill themselves. Combining the two dimensions that we discussed this evening that I think underlie the perspective of the brothers. Indeed, from Adam through Jacob, there was one designated spiritual heir. But the goal, the ideal, was never that everyone else should be cast-offs. And then, again, remember, God reassures Abraham. He's blessing Ishmael. God, likewise, bestows upon Esau and company their inheritance in the land of Seir. No one really is a cast-off. Rather on the contrary, in order for the world ultimately to attain its spiritual goal, in order for the world to be fulfilled, and for each and every individual to be fulfilled in it, it's of critical importance for there to be the spiritual heirs, the spiritual leaders. Their suspicions about Joseph are that he doesn't see things that way. But his brothers do. And ultimately, his brothers, all of them, together with Joseph, are in fact the spiritual heirs of Jacob. And as for their aversion to kingship, yeah, we do have this aversion to kingship. But we do need leaders. We recognize that. But ultimately, we need the leaders not because we need kings of self-aggrandizement like Nimrod and Amraphel and the others who've already been mentioned, but rather in actualizing the mission that was the charge of Abraham and his offspring, as God expressed it back in chapter 18. For I have known him to the end that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of God to do righteousness and justice. That's the mission. Everything ultimately is subordinate to that. And every individual needs to find his or her unique role in the advancement of that mission. Joseph is perceived as a threat because he's getting in the way of that. It's not a matter of a personal vendetta. But so far as Joseph's brothers are concerned, indeed, the spiritual legacy of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob depends upon it, and he's threatening it. But for us, again, inevitably, we return to our starting point. It's always our starting point. Torah is teaching. It's teaching us how to live. And in presenting the brother's concerns, while not excusing them at all, it's important for us to discern their message is indeed everyone has a role to play, and if he's trying to cast us off, we need to get rid of him. We're not going to be cast-offs. Everyone has a calling. Everyone is summoned by God. If you allow me to conclude with a passage from an author whom we have quoted in the past, one of the foremost Bible scholars of the 19th century, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. We are all working on one great edifice, all the nations, the ones that have been and are gone, and the ones that still exist in the east, the west, the south, and the north. Each one through its activities upon the stage of history and through its decline, through its successes and its failures, its virtue and its vices, its wisdom and its folly, its rise and its fall, and through the legacy that it has left to posterity as the sum total of its existence. All this is a contribution to the one edifice of humanity. All men are being guided toward serving the one God. The righteous among the nations who exemplified unselfish justice and genuine human dignity lived for this goal. The enlightened among them labored for it when they lifted up their brethren by word and deed to the one alone, to respect for justice and to the elevation of man above the level of beasts. Toward the overall goal of humanity, the art of the Greeks, to the extent that it was morally clean, had a refining effect on the mind. And their thought, to the extent that it embodied truth, enlightened the spirit. Toward this end, the Romans sword united the nations, and in a more peaceful way, the trade of the Europeans laid the basis for a brotherly community of nations. Israel, too, has contributed to this end in its own way. But everyone has a role to play here. Everyone has a calling. Everyone ultimately is part of that mission. That, ironically, is the indirect message that we learn from Joseph's brothers, because it was that which they felt Joseph was threatening. To recognize that there may indeed be spiritual heirs, but no one is cast off. Everyone, at the very least, has that supporting role in advancing the cause of spirituality, the goal of godliness in the world. And although we do need leaders, leaders should never be trampling their subjects underfoot. Because again, we are all together, the leaders and the led, servants of God, advancing His agenda in the world, all of us together. That is perhaps the most crucial message. And that, I submit, is a crucial dimension of what the Torah is teaching us here. May we heed it, and may we actualize our missions, our calling to God in our lives. God bless you.